Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for coming tonight to our talk. I'm Michaela Morse. I'm assistant professor here in religious studies, and I teach Japanese Buddhism. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for tonight, Professor Caleb Carter. He's associate professor of Japanese religions and Buddhist studies at Kyushu University in Japan. And he received his PhD in Buddhist studies from UCLA. And after that, he first taught at UCLA and then later also at Johns Hopkins University before he then moved to Kyushu in Japan, as I mentioned before. His research focuses on mountain-based practices and traditions, especially Shugendo. And he's the author of A Path in the Mountains. This book here was published last year with the University of Hawaii Press. And this is a very innovative and important work in the study of Japanese religions, and it focuses on mountain practices in Nagano Prefecture and really sheds new light on the formation of religious sites and traditions from the 13th to 19th century, so very long time period. And it uses really a wealth of materials, and he really foregrounds how you can bring a lot of different materials in the conversation. He uses like miracle tales, doctrinal works, travel literature, legends, and also material culture in his book. So it's really innovative in that sense. And he also examines here very interesting issues related to Shugendo and also to Tendai and mountain practices like the economics of pilgrimages, ritual practices, and of course very important for mountain sites in Japan, the exclusion of women from religious sites or the inclusion of women of religious sites in different time periods. So it's really highly recommended to check this book out if you have time. It's really interesting and fascinating. But today, Professor Carter will talk about a different part of his research on more modern or contemporary issues, and he will talk about numerous ascents, mountaineering, nature, and ethnospirituality in modern Japan. Please join me with a warm welcome for Professor Caleb Carter.
Okay, thank you so much for that warm introduction, Michaela. And thanks to the Ho Center for inviting me and hosting me on this occasion, especially Irene and Wen for your help with all the logistics and whatnot. I was thinking back as I was preparing this talk to my very first academic talk, and it was actually at Stanford. And on that occasion, I think it was a graduate symposium for the banality of religion was what the theme was. And I remember being so nervous, and I walked up to the podium, and I had my paper in hand, and it was unstapled, so I could easily, leaf through. I put it on the podium, and I kind of reached down to the laptop, and the paper has come off, and it just go. It was quite a way to start. So no paper today, just the laptop. So, as Michaela mentioned, this is kind of a new research project for me. So I'm really excited to share it with you, and I'm also feel like I'm somewhat workshopping it. So I really look forward to your comments and questions, okay? This is going to bring me from my first project, which was kind of as early as 13th century up into the mid-Edo period, looking at Shugendo and its sort of formation as a Buddhist tradition in Japan, into this one being more modern period and even stepping away from kind of orthodox religion as we think of, into mountaineering as a modern sport, and thinking about kind of religious influences or how we might look at that history through a religious studies perspective. So these are some pictures I took a few months ago at Tateyama, which is in the what's called the Japanese Alps now in central Japan. And if you spend time in the mountains in Japan or going about hiking or whatnot, you may come across people that have purchased amulets at the shrine below and then wear them on the backpack, the jackets, on the way up as a way to kind of protect them on the trail and assure safe ascent. Here, this is on top of Tateyama. You see a ritual being performed that I just came across when I was climbing the mountain, and there's a Shinto priest, and the hikers here have basically commissioned the shrine. They bought a sort of prayer slip, and then there's a ritual conducted for them. And they might be praying for a safe trip up and down the mountain, or it could be something else in their personal lives. This is inside the shrine on the summit, and then that view right there is if you stepped outside, that's what you'd see. And as the day progresses, it gets a little bit warmer. Then they hold that outside. There was actually a typhoon the day before, so things had kind of locked down, so they're doing it inside the shrine here. So these clues, I think, would suggest that there are certain intersections between mountaineering and more broadly outdoor sports and religiosity. But that's not how it's commonly understood, I think, in Japan and elsewhere. So I'll start with a brief quote here. This is by Yanagita Kunio, who's very famous as kind of forefather of folk studies in Japan. He was actually an early member of the Japanese Alpine Club too, which is kind of an interesting facet of his life. And he writes, "It was during the Meiji period that mountain climbing gained popularity. Formerly an expression of religious faith, it became a sport and a chance for travel and adventure." So on the surface, this seems like a fairly innocuous statement. I think we'd all agree with it to some extent. But at the same time, his words are indicative of a binary that I think we all kind of have grown accustomed to. And that is between alpinism on the one hand and then religiosity on the other. If we dig into this a bit more, I think we find that it rests on a number of intellectual presuppositions. So, common views that you'll probably be fully aware of yourselves. Mountain worship, on the one hand, is often aligned with things like tradition, religion, piety, cultural, maybe a cultural heritage for Japan, for example. Part of this stems from its modern historiography of being viewed as a folk religion. This is something that I kind of challenge in the book that I wrote. And on the other side, you have mountaineering, which is largely viewed as modern, secular, recreational, international. And then if you take that one step further, it could almost be seen as a replacement for mountain worship. So what I'm interested in is the idea that these are intersecting at different points between two things is what I'm looking at. One is continuities, which I'm calling it that, and the other one is religiosities. Continuities would be kind of a shared realm of practice, social and material components, so shared topography on the mountain, shared tools sometimes, implements, and shared kind of orientation toward the mountains. So these are mainly things in kind of the physical and material realm. And then religiosities, I'm thinking here about how mountaineers, especially elite mountaineers in the late 19th century and early 20th century, were thinking about their new sport, how to conceptualize it, what to place it against in order to understand it as something of their own. And as they were doing this, they were also contributing to the construction of modern intellectual categories like, say, religion, tradition, even nature, and thinking about how they were doing that, especially in their writing. Some of the recent works that I'm interested in, sort of influencing my thinking on this, that maybe go beyond, say, Japanese religions too. Charles Taylor's A Secular Age, because I think he really dismantles the secularization theory, which would be prominent, of course, in thinking of mountain worship going on to a secular path of mountaineering. Peter van der Veer has done interesting research on the construction of kind of categories like spirituality and magic and secularity in the modern era, especially through British influence. And then a book by one of your own, Jason Josephson Storm, whose work is particularly influential for me in thinking about the kind of modern construction of religion as it occurred in Japan too. And then in that construction, created contingent categories like superstition and Shinto secular as well. So I've been in this project now for roughly a year or so, off and on, and I've kind of got moving parts to it. But these are the kind of bullet points that I'm working with right now that may become chapters in the book. Beginning with just thinking about what's happening with mountain climbing in both Great Britain and Japan, particularly in the 19th century, because in Britain, intellectuals and writers, poets are increasingly going into the mountains. Some of it is for scientific kind of exploration. It's also things related to romanticism and even ways of seeing the natural world as a sort of manifestation of God's work and a way to kind of connect with God in those terms. And in Japan, you have, of course, lots of other things going on too. And one of the prominent things that's happening in the early modern period is the increase in pilgrimage. So 18th century onward, you're getting increasing numbers of lay pilgrims going up into the mountains. Formerly, it was just religious ascetics specialists that would go into the mountains for religious purposes. And you get many more of kind of a broader public that are now interested in climbing mountains. You also have some new ascents of quite difficult peaks, and this is before the arrival of British influence. I'm also looking at British mountaineers. These are the main ones that are coming in from the European area, and thinking about their impact on mountaineering among kind of intellectual circles in the Tokyo area and beyond. Japanese mountaineers who start building their own tradition, partly through their own alpine club, and are also friends and climbing partners sometimes with the British. These shared orientations and practices, this is what I'll talk about today, these kind of continuities in material form. Guides, relationship with between guides and mountain climbers, and then finally kind of a marginalization of certain types of mountain worship that I think is done by modern mountaineers. And you can see I've kind of got it thematically arranged around a few mountain peaks too. So the marginalization at Ontake, which is pictured here. So that's kind of the general layout. So in terms of continuities, I've just begun this work of looking at basically articles and reports from the Japanese Alpine Club's journal, which starts getting published in 1906, and looking at those for references to religious practices and whatnot, or beliefs, or even references to the mountains that are being climbed. So that's kind of my lens of analysis. Now, maybe just to take a step back, because I think probably many of you are not necessarily familiar with mountain worship in Japan, and so what would be considered a continuity, right? Just to speak in maybe very general and ahistorical terms, because I don't have time to go into a lot of depth, but the mountains were kind of a premier site of worship by mountain ascetics, dating back to 8th century at least, often Buddhist orientation, although some of it is Taoist influence as well, indigenous too. And you have ascetics, you also have pilgrims that eventually start going into the mountains. This is more beginning the 18th century. And there's lots of reasons for that. Part of this has to do with agriculture in the country, because water, one of the main sources for water, is in the mountains. So people were very well aware of that, of course, and would pray to gods in the mountains for proper waterfall, not too much of it, just the right amount for their crops. even things like maritime travel, because they'd serve as landmarks along the coast, ensuring sailors and boats knew where they were. In the mountains, there were believed to reside Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. There were also local spirits, local gods, known as kami often. There were dragon spirits. Dragons are, of course, famous for kind of controlling the elements in the water, and so they'd be prayed to for proper rainfall. Also ghosts and kind of more malicious forces. So it was, maybe in simple terms, kind of a love-hate relationship of esteeming the mountains as a very powerful place that is necessary for crops and other things in life, but also feared somewhat in the imagination because of what might be lurking there. And I would say they go a sort of gradual process of domestication that starts happening in the Edo period and then more so in the 20th century. So these were sentiments that were kind of widespread across class, gender, and region. And some of that continues into modern alpinism, which shouldn't really be a surprise because these are widespread ideas that people that are now climbing mountains as a sport continue to think about. So I want to just share two examples from articles that I was looking at recently. They're both authored by women, and that's partly because I'm also interested in how women are navigating mountaineering. Historically, they were often excluded from mountains, so that's another objective in my research goals. But Noguchi Yukako is the first female member of the Japanese Alpine Club, which I'll come back to in a moment, the club itself. She was an instructor at Gakushuin, which was a very elite school set up by the imperial court as a women's school. And she writes a report about the first female, or at least first known, female ascent of the mountain. It's her and several other women and several men in this party. And so some references that caught my attention. First of all, she says there's 3 paths up the mountain. They take a mountain that's typically used by the mountain ascetics. So that suggests that they're already relying on a trail that's established by mountain ascetics, and it's probably a more difficult one. She does talk about considerable challenges on the trail itself on the way up. As they're beginning their approach, 2 men descend. They're carrying lots of sticks, so they've probably been gathering sticks on the mountains. And this party asks the 2 men, how's the weather, what are the conditions like? And the men respond, well, it's pretty bad up there, you probably don't want to go. And then they end by saying that it's no place for a woman to be climbing. She later in the report kind of laments the fact that people believe that if women go up there, their sinful character will basically anger the local gods and kind of unleash the god's wrath on the site. So that's the context that she's aware of and she writes about. They decide to go anyway, and it's a beautiful day. Actually, it takes 2 days, so they spend the night in one of the pilgrimage huts along the way. They get to the summit, and then she has almost sort of a religious experience on the summit. So she describes being in this place that's sort of engulfed by clouds, very mysterious, and that there are these beautiful alpine flowers all around her. She says that they're called Seinangusa, which translates as immortal's grass. And that is because they remove defilements and impurities, according to what she's learned. And she goes on, she goes to a little bit further along the summit, and she recognizes a statue of Yakushi, or the medicine Buddha. She goes to a small shrine right beside it and prays there. And finally, I'm skipping a lot here, but she descends the mountain, and kind of looking back at it in the night, she's really admiring it. And she notes to herself that even though she climbed it, no harm was done. The gods didn't freak out on her climb. So it's sort of an interesting sense of progress in the sense that she's now part of this mountaineering community who are, in some sense, trying to push back against that and establish mountaineering as something that women can equally do alongside men. At the same time, you still see through this report lingering beliefs about these concerns about women climbing. The next example is by Kobayashi Susumuko. I couldn't find out anything about her biography, but she describes a climb up Mount Fuji. You can see Fuji here. And by the way, this mountain is Iwate, which is what Noguchi's party climbed. So similar cone volcano. For Kobayashi's party, it's composed of 3 women and 7 men. And the objective is scientific exploration. They're going to be studying weather patterns in the mountain and looking at vegetation. So a lot of the reports in Sangaku, this journal, are premised on kind of scientific exploration. Throughout the day, they patronize the shrine complex of Fuji, which is Sengen Shrine. They start out the morning by going there and basically praying for a safe ascent. It's around 1:30 a.m., so this is an early start, and they receive a ritual purification. Midway up, they stop at a pilgrimage lodge, and she states that they all buy Kongozue staffs, like this one here, and which is kind of common ritual implement for pilgrims. Kongo is adamantine, or kind of the diamond is often translated. And then they all wear hajimaki headgear too. And then they receive a ritual purification outside of the lodge and are ready to go on. So already they're sort of dressing themselves as pilgrims, which is kind of interesting, I think. They get to the top, and she notes on kind of the sublime nature, the beauty of the main shrine at the summit. She gets her staff kind of emblazed with the seal of the top, and same on the hachimaki too. And then they climb down, and they get to the same Sengen shrine at the base, and she goes and expresses her gratitude to the kami there. And this is a very common pattern in worship in Japan and I'm sure beyond. But first, petitioning the gods for something, and then when it's received, going back and expressing thanks for that. It's interesting. In this report, I find that there's no references to kind of gendered differences or stigmatization, and I think that that's partly because there's a longer tradition of women climbing Fuji, not that much longer, but at least early 1800s, that women were progressively going higher and higher in pilgrimage groups. And then the mountaineers, females, began climbing it in the Meiji period more, so she wouldn't have been the first. Both examples are reports that are coming out of this Modern Alpine Club's journal, so you'd expect them, if you have the simple binary, to not have any references to religious practices. But there doesn't seem to be any contradiction by the authors in sharing them in these reports. So that's on the continuity side. Now I'll shift to religiosities and thinking about how the mountaineering elites were involved in shaping modern intellectual categories. So British mountaineers in Japan, as I mentioned before, British mountaineers, at least in Great Britain and Scotland and Europe, were climbing throughout the 19th century as a form of leisure and exploration too. And they had new ideas about the mountains. So they were not viewing these mountains as godless, treacherous places, which was the common idea about, say, the European Alps before the 18th century. Now they were thinking of the mountains as connected to God and a way to kind of experience that connection and witness sort of the sublime, a new concept as well. Now, Walter Weston is the most famous among these British mountaineers. He's actually an Anglican missionary. He spent a total of 15 years in Japan over the course of 3 trips, first in Kumamoto in southern Japan, then in Kobe, and then in Yokohama. And in the summers, he would go and climb mountains. This is maybe where his true passion lied. He wrote quite a lot. These are the 4 books that he authored. He also gave lectures often in England and wrote letters and essays. So there's lots to kind of read of his. And some of the themes that I find in his work are a real interest in mountain worship, traditional mountain worship in Japan. I was really surprised when I picked up this first book because I was thinking, okay, it's going to be about mountaineering. And he immediately starts writing about Kukai and no Gyoja and kind of the history of mountaineering. He calls them mountaineers. So that's kind of an interesting way to talk about what seems like it would be a more contemporaneous or mountaineering subject in his work. He does exhibit a sense of nostalgia, which I think is related to ideas about the folk, which is also an emerging idea in this time period. It's in Japan, of course, with figures like Yanagita Kunio, but it's also in relation to England too, and through the process of industrialization, thinking of the countryside as sort of a vessel of a timeless folk, right? Somewhat, it's a problematic notion, I would suggest, but he finds that not only in England, but on his mountaineering trips too. So the way he talks about peasants when he's climbing as being kind of the place where you find real Japan, right? There's a bit of Orientalism in his writing too. I found this especially in regard to Ontake, Mount Ontake, which is one of the sections that I'm writing about, in terms of describing some of their seances, or sort of possession type rituals are a big part of their ritual performance. And so he writes about those in somewhat exotified terms. But in his own experience of climbing the mountains, he will often kind of connect it to something more transcendental, which is kind of what I'm looking at, what interests me in particular. So just one example here, he writes, "Nowadays, many Japanese are learning the great lesson that mountaineering has to teach its willing followers. How good a thing it is for a man to get out of himself, to leave the great cities reared by human hands, and to rise up into those high and holy places whose most stirring appeal is that made to his spiritual nature, where what most deeply impresses the soul is the presence of an unseen dominion and the power of an invisible omnipresence." So in essence, he's thinking of the mountain trail as literally a way to kind of get above the mundane, everyday world below, and then transcend that through the climb. Okay, so now shift to Japanese mountaineering. The Japanese Alpine Club was established in 1905. It was actually it was established by this man, Kojima Usui, in direct kind of collaboration with Walter Weston. So in the first issue of the journal that they publish, Sangaku, there's sort of correspondence between the two, and Weston writes to Kojima after having left back for England again and says, okay, you guys have this small informal research group now, but you should really turn it into an Alpine Club. And we have one, the British Alpine Club, which you can model years after. And he sends all of the kind of protocol and guidelines of the British Alpine Club over to Kojima. And that becomes kind of their model to build their own Alpine Club. Now, Kojima is among a small circle of elite climbers, mainly in the Tokyo area. He is a banker, so he's well off. He comes from a well-off family too. And he's also a literary and cultural critic, so he's very interested in all forms of literature. A lot of it's he's reading coming from Europe. He seems to be able to read German and English, and cultural in terms of artwork too. All of the cover designs for the journal are quite beautiful wood blocks, which he I think was responsible for at least commissioning too, and was a collector of wood blocks. And so he's typically portrayed as kind of the quintessential Meiji era modern man in a very secular sense. So one article that I came across that seemed to suggest something very different is this essay titled Sangaku Suhai Don, or kind of a treatise on mountain worship that he wrote in 1913, so this is about 7 years or so after the journal is established. And I'll just read you a few passages that I think are kind of indicative of where his thinking is going with this essay. He writes, in the past, the explanations of devotees of mountain religion were excessive in utilitarian function and purpose. Nowadays, no one in the educated class views mountains as sacred or prays to them for the eradication of karma and attainment of bliss in the next life. So he's really kind of separating himself off as a enlightened modern intellectual that doesn't believe in any of that stuff. He says, I take meaning from a mountain climb in the pure air, the physical cleansing, the absorption of knowledge, the vastness of the skies, and the loss of self in the surrounding environment. Yet, is it only from these collective benefits gained in the toil of the ascent that I take pleasure? So here's where the essay kind of begins, that he's started out by saying that he doesn't believe in any of this older, superstitious stuff, but actually there may be something missing. That reminded me of recently reading from Charles Taylor's work, and he talks about kind of the haunted age that we live in which the sort of enchanted world that humans lived in, say in Renaissance and before. I mean, he's focused on modern Europe, but that's been emptied out, and with that emptying has been a sort of loss of meaning in life and in humanity. And so now there's new conditions of belief where people have to navigate what is meaningful for themselves. And so he seems to be doing some of that here. And he continues, in my early mountaineering days, I summoned as many of these aspirations as I could, but I fear they were incomplete. Now I wonder if I unknowingly took refuge in their logical basis. Perhaps there's nothing special in them, that in fact disciples of mountain religion hold a deeper connection to the mountains, one that emerges within the interior space of the mind, exceeds knowledge based on the science of glaciers and rocks, and transcends intellectual concepts. So he's kind of thinking about religion in a newer sense of what religion is being sort of constructed in this time period as a more interior experience, one that is maybe connecting with a higher force more directly, and almost more of a maybe philosophical experience than some of the other things that he's critiquing earlier. Next, he talks about the will of nature. And before he does this, he explicitly mentions Schopenhauer, who has an essay titled Will of Nature, where he describes nature as kind of not God per se, but as a sort of universal essence to the entire world that actually moves along via a conscious will. And I guess as an aside, Schopenhauer is apparently borrowing from Neo-Confucianism thought, Jushi and others, which is quite interesting now that it's looping back to Kojima. But he's sort of influenced by that idea in now constructing a new idea of what nature is and what it means to be in the natural world in the mountains. And so he writes, the will of nature is evident in our ancestors' closeness to Mount Fuji and lack of hesitation in taking the peak as the great leader of their mountain religion. The question of whether nature has a will of its own, indeed a prescient philosophical question, is no doubt a tough one. I prefer discussing this from a philosophical standpoint rather than a geological one. That said, I would not interpret that intentionality as one of goodwill towards humans, nor would I interpret it as the omniscience and omnipotence of Kami, or the great compassion and mercy of the Buddhas. So again, he's distinguishing himself. He's from religion, but kind of drawing on Schopenhauer in this idea of how we might understand the experience of climbing a mountain, or how he might. There's also a hint of what I'm calling ethnospirituality here, with a reference toward Fuji, which he continues with here. This is the last passage. And he writes, regarding the will of nature and the philosophical question of why there is an affinity between humans and mountains in Japan, take its volcanoes, and in particular, Mount Fuji. Why is it that the Japanese Alps, unlike the European Alps, were more than just contour lines on a map, or white towers rising from empty space? In ancient times, when mankind had no connections to the mountains, why was it only in Japan, where mountains were not viewed as useless places far from the spiritual realm of humans? It's because of Mount Fuji's existence as a volcano, indeed a textbook volcano. Why is it that our ancestors felt a connection to this classic volcano? It's because they took its terrifying precipices as elegant and beautiful, and as something dear to them. So, there's a lot of things you can kind of pull out of this passage, but one idea would be sort of Nihonjinron, or this sort of idea that the Japanese are exceptional, which becomes prominent, well, from this time and even earlier, 18th century, into the present. And it's interesting because he's taking Mount Fuji as the classic example, and he's quoting poetry collections like the Manyoshu, ancient 9th century collection, to say that here are these references of people looking at Fuji as this kind of divine mountain. And look at the European Alps on the other side. They were seen as godless places that no one would ever go into. And we understood from the start that that's not the case, right? Of course, it's not totally true. If you look at, plenty of literary sources from Japan too, people were terrified as well. But according to the argument that he wants to make, that it's a little bit special in Japan. That's Kojima's writing, and I want to just end with this quote by Shigetaka, who is quite famous at this time, more so than Kojima, because he was really he was a writer and really and a geologist too, but he's really writing about Japan as a place that should be considered special and exceptional. And he wants to spread that sense of appreciation, across Japan, that everyone recognizes the landscape in particular to be monumental and beautiful. And so his work here in Nihon Fukeidon, or kind of treatise to the Japanese landscape, sells many copies over time. And he was actually also an honorary member of the Japanese Alpine Club. And so he's got a section toward the end of this book explicitly devoted to mountain climbing. And in that section, he writes this passage, when you gain the summit and look down, it's as though a gorgeous painting were opening at your feet, revealing the contours of the earth's surface spreading out before you. Once you've experienced the sublime qualities of mountains, once you've awakened to their magnificent splendor, once you've taken a deep breath of the alpine air, so fresh that it seems to cleanse your lungs, once you have allowed your thoughts to fall still and become immersed in the lonely quiet there, then your mind will become like those of the gods and sages, and you experience firsthand the glow of divine wisdom. For these reasons, a mountain is at once the most fascinating, the most magnificent, the most noble, and the most sacred thing in the natural world. This is why we must cultivate a mountaineering spirit. So he's thinking in almost a nation-building sense. Mountaineering is very important too for building our kind of national pride. Now, one caveat is that apparently he never climbed mountains. So it's not clear where this reference is coming from. It's also known that part of his writing was lifted from Basil Chamberlain and W.B. Mason's Handbook for Travelers in Japan, which was published in 1891. I need to look it up specifically to see if this comes exactly from that too. But it does show this kind of cross-pollination between British ideas about the mountains and how Japanese intellectuals are picking up those ideas and then kind of turning them into something new. So these are some examples that show how mountaineers at the turn of the 20th century were both adopting and sharing elements from existing forms of mountain worship, and also contributing to the formation of novel intellectual categories as they conceptualized their sport in ways that resonate down to the present. And just as a final note, I'll say that this research feels personal to me too. I love the mountains, hiking, alpine climbing, camping, whatnot. None of this is religious, or I don't understand it as religious per se. But when I do these activities, it's an experience that does somehow transcend my mundane world. And I've never been quite sure how to understand this, but part of that is why I began this project, to sort of figure that out. And I suspect that I'm not the only one that feels that way. I'm hoping that this historical look might shed some light on what the natural world means to us and how these inherited intellectual categories can both aid and hinder our orientations toward the mountains and the greater natural world. So, thank you.